something much more. If you could just close the door. You sense that there is more ontological thrust to it, and if so, how does that work through language? Right? I think that's kind of what. That's the literary question. You have several levels of evolving the style to a much more extended lament, but we would all share this notion that the text in Job, is it only because of the prologue? Is it only because of this larger setting? Or is there something in the language that makes this into a more philosophical statement about the nature of selfhood and not just a guy who got slammed by his enemies? Right? You can't avoid the fact that Jeremiah is only speaking to his particular situation. Job too speaks of a situation, but some people, the objective correlative of Job is actually a universal person. So we sense that there's something more at stake. Anybody want to respond to that, or we can just leave it on the table for Tzvi to meditate on? It's not an irrelevant issue. It's a question that you're posing back to the text, right? Insofar as the text begins to evoke ontological issues, a much larger sense of finitude, a much larger sense of human destiny, right? Right? Anyway, bear that in mind, how a particular text works to kind of evoke different kinds of concerns. Now, I want to turn to chapter 28, which is a vital turning point in the book. Some people have called it a meditation on wisdom. The speaker is not given, right? And it disrupts and terminates the cycle. Although it's an incomplete cycle, there is a purported threefold structure through chapter 27. Now, the purported structure is that Job speaks, then each of the friends speak once, and he responds. It's broken because of the transmission of the text, but that's the putative structure, that it's a threefold sequence, and then it's disrupted, and then you have Elihu. We may or may not want to get into it right now, but whether he's an addition or it's an intentional addition, Maimonides would say it's an intentional addition. We can leave that aside for the time being. But there is, the voice is not named, so that affects the nature of the questions. And then, as we'll see at the end, there is a theological, or there's a theophany of speech. There's a teaching. It has been told to you. Who told, when, how. But God said this somehow, right? Or it has been said. So,
short question.
Yeah.
In chapter 27 and in 29, you have Job speaking.
Again.
Is there any reason to claim that it's saying...
I think a lot of I don't want to get into the text critical questions. Some people would assume that, for example, chapter 29 and following is an addition, that these are additions that were supplemented. For example, the section in 29 and following is very similar to material we know from Egyptian wisdom literature, where a person says that he strengthened the hands of the weak and he walked and he did all these ethical things. I mean, if that was organic, it would have had a more interesting play right before Eliphaz's speech, right after he claims, he said, because he says, you did this, and when it hits you, you didn't do anything. So obviously this is a text that's gone through several stages of redaction. We can't go into all of that, and I think that would partially explain all of that, as well as the Elihu material.
Also the opening of 27-29, but also
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. So there is a kind of conclusion, and then the material seems to end, and then there is that Vayosef, and there was something that was added on. So we won't go into this aspect, but let's pick up on 28. So maybe how is 28 structured and how do questions work? Remember that the larger context that we've been dealing with up to this point is that the force of the questions reflect the desire of the speaker to explain the purpose and meaning of experience in life, right? The questions are designed to provide a ratio of either challenge or response that one could in fact try to either be puzzled by or counter the arguments or present a kind of rational argument about the purpose of life and what is happening, that it's not simply a total abandon. Okay? What happens in chapter 28? How is the genre changed and how do the questions work as a pivotal text that's different from the kind of questions that appear in the opening from chapters 3 to 27? Yeah?
Well, this is more of a general statement, but I think maybe they're less expectant of an answer and more rhetorical, in the sense that instead of creating a space for, let's say, Job to give an answer and has to speak up for himself, it creates a space to just consider the very notion of whatever they're asking. So here it says in my translation, but where can wisdom be found? Where is the source of understanding? This kind of brings us to a space of musing more than an analytical questioning of Job's existence and his belief and his purpose.
I think that's very nice. So part of what you're saying is in the opening chapters there's voice, there's dialogical encounter with another face, and there is discourse on the validity or lack of validity of the questions and the claims that are put forward. Now, there's an attempt to make judgments and to come to conclusions. And it's not presented logically, as you say, it's not a philosophical treatise, presented abstractly. It's presented through imagery and the passion of the voice that's speaking. And it's trying to convince, right? The type of convincing is to convince the interlocutor. And then where your interesting intervention here is that what happens now is that we're talking about an abstract, all of a sudden, the particular claims of suffering, the claims of why a particular person has suffered, the claim to traditional knowledge, the claim to personal experience as a counterpoint between traditional knowledge and personal experience, the claim that one knows how to interpret the facts of life is not, or the very notion of whether a person can serve God chinam, for no end. None of those issues are on the table, right? In fact, the issue of chokhmah, wisdom, wasn't even raised, except to say, do you know my servant Job? But that's simply a question of awareness, right? We're going to jump back after we do this to look at chapter 12 to see he does raise a certain issue of who knows, right? But more or less, the argument hasn't turned on the problematic of wisdom or wisdom as a hypostasis, as some kind of an ontological entity, right? Right? So we've entered a slightly different speculative universe. It's more speculative. You called it musing and meditation, but it's also in the genre of what people would say speculative wisdom in the ancient Near East. Now, if you look at Mishlei, you're dealing with pragmatic, eudaimonistic wisdom, right? You know, how can you be happy? How do you find the real meaning of chayim, of life? How do you prevent yourself from falling into a pit, literally and figuratively? What are the things that you do? So the notion of Mishlei is Eitzah v'tushia. It's a kind of a good wisdom. You know, like how do you do it? How do you live? Now we're in the framework of speculative questions, right? And we're in the framework of a notion of Chokhmah like we have, for example, in Proverbs 8, right? That Chokhmah was created by God, Reshit Darko, Hashem Kanani Reshit Darko. God created wisdom at the beginning, and He created the world with this attribute of wisdom. So anything we know on the nature of the world from that point of view is through this cognitive, this attribute of wisdom, of knowledge, right? So the structure of the world utilized not just power, but it was filtered through something called Chokhmah. The DNA of the plants, the rotation of the planets, the structure of the human circulatory system. These would be evidence of Chokhmah, right? So everything that we would see is, and Chokhmah is already understood as an abstract. So it doesn't. We're even earlier than that. I mean, this is a notion that goes back much earlier. The Egyptians had this notion as well, and it's not just a matter of Sophia, of a Greek philosophical notion, but it's how it emerges at this point may have some kind of bearing on this early beginning of speculation that wisdom is an entity. Okay? And that's what you're picking up. We have a speculation. So, as you said, let's go through the text, and then I want to come back to these issues. So, why don't anybody want to read it in English, and then those of you who do the Hebrew, you can follow the Hebrew, so that we're all on a level playing field.
28 or 29?
What? 28. Okay, anybody want to read it? If you want, if it's easy for you in Hebrew, do that. But we're going to read it in English, so we're all together on this. So let me read in the Shendlin translation. So he's already changed the text. Okay, we know there is a place where gold is found, right? And so he's personified this. That's not really the way the text has emerged. The text is much starker. Ki yesh lakesef mozah. Surely there is a place where it can be found. Umakom lezahav yazoku, and a place where gold can be refined. So let me actually read the maybe JPS a little bit more. See where we go here.
Whose translation of the book of Job is JPS? Is it one particular person?
If one person who did it? No, they did. It's a committee. It's a committee. One person did the draft, and then it was a committee decision. Okay, so it's a little closer here. There is a mine for silver, and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth, copper smelted from rock. He sets bounds for darkness. To every limit man probes, so that man is the subject here, right? To rocks in deepest darkness, they opened up a shaft far from where men live, in places forgotten by wayfarers, destitute of men, far removed. Earth out of which food grows is changed below as if into fire. Its rocks are a source of sapphire, contains gold dust too. No bird of prey knows the path to it. The falcon's eye has not gazed, the proud beast has not reached it, the lion has not crossed it. The human being sets his hand against the flinty rock and overturns mountains. He carves out channels, his eyes behold every precious thing. He dams up the sources of streams so that hidden things may be brought to light. So before we get to the first question, we have a rhetorical setup, right? The rhetorical setup is to set up that first question, but where can wisdom be found? Where's the source of understanding? In other words, before the questioner gets to the abstract question, he is showing the remarkable supremacy of man the maker, homo faber, right? All the stuff that Hannah Arendt spoke about, work, man the maker. But this is the nobility of man the maker, not simply man the pragmatist, not just man the tech who knows techne, or it's a kind of techne, and it's a remarkable thing. He can plummet the earth, he can go to the ore, the veins of ore in the deepest rock, things that these incredible animals with hawk eyes can't do. And not only that, the human being is a kind of cosmic smith. He can transform metals, right? There is this notion of, it's not quite alchemy, but it's the alchemist, the mystery of the alchemist. The mystery of the alchemist is the mystery of the human scientist. He not only locates things, but he can transform the basic issues of the earth into their components. Alchemy is just one form of that, right? Or finding the philosopher's gold is just another form of that. But the notion is that the mind of Homo faber can transform the earth. And man the maker, the one who makes. Okay? So there's this glorification that the mind of the human being has extraordinary techne, has extraordinary skill. Not only can find the hidden notions of veins of ore in the rock, but actually knows already how to transform that to make techne for life. Right? Make alloys, make transformations. Right? So already we have a text that is glorifying the wisdom, but chokhmah as the wisdom of, let's say, the chokhmah of a person like Bezalel, right? It's the chokhmah of a person who is an architect, who is a builder, who is a maker, who is a constructor. It's not negated, it's glorified in an extraordinary way. But there is chokhmah as skill, and there's chokhmah as true wisdom. And they're making a distinction here between wisdom as the cleverness of mind and wisdom as a mode, as a disposition towards the world. Not quite, because it's not going to be philosophical, but it's a difference between having the ability to do things and a disposition towards reality. As we'll see, of Chokhmah as a disposition in the Heideggerian sense, or however we want to say it. But it's an orientation towards the world with having a crude wisdom. So then we see that the text makes an about face, right? The same person has asked the question, but where can wisdom be found? So you see this Ve'ha-chokhmah me'ayin timatzeh. So it's playing on the beginning, because we had matzah, motza. Where is it me'ayin timatzeh? Right? Where can it be found? Right? In other words, notice the conceptual, the ezem makom bina. What is the power of this question, and how does this change the epistemology and the ontology of the inquiry? We have a remarkable pivot point here. So the question, which is not just an epistemological question, it changes the ontology. What's the key? What's the key?
Oh, I had a question.
Well, first answer my question, then we can. Yeah.
He's sort of saying that, to use Aristotelian terms, that wisdom is not ontologically in the lunar realm or
sublunar. Okay.
It's not something that is immanent somehow to
Right.
explore.
So in other words, you're right. I think, notice that the first part of the text, which is being played on the second part of the text, has spatialized wisdom. It's spatialized wisdom into things, right? Wisdom does things with things. And the ontological shift by saying, me'ayin timatzeh, turns the question of space into an absurd question. Right? And by turning that into an absurd question, it changes wisdom from an entity into a quality, into a spiritual quality. Or, no, we don't want to use a term like essence, but it's something that is no longer a manifestation through technique, or you can find it. Wisdom can be found with a person who can do X. But where's the source of what that person can do? That's the new question. Where's the source of that? And what is the place of Bina? Okay, so the two are placed here, and that's the radical new question, right? Which surprises the reader with a speculative philosophical question that's totally different. Now, the book which has been working on puzzling example, in other words, well, let me raise it as a question. Would you say that by doing this as a ligature or continuity, the interlocutor here has turned rhetoric into just another form of human cleverness? Right? So you have to ask, what is the prior issue that was at stake, right? If you have a twist that the human being is super clever, and now he's using a tradition from the wisdom tradition about a particular form of cleverness, namely the transmutation of metals, right? The transmutation of things. That is, and then he moves to that third point. But what is the source of that skill? That's a philosophical question. In my mind, it seems that it turns the preceding questions about, I know this and you know that, and I know, it turns that into just another rhetoric. That kind of argumentative rhetoric in the first part is simply another case of human skill, but it doesn't penetrate to the core of, do you really know? Yeah.
I think this plays back to, in chapter 1, verse 11, or not verse 11, I'm sorry, 21.
Which is?
It says, the Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. So we have the material, the here, the things that we can understand and manipulate, and we can see through the rock and find the ore, and we can, all of these things, but we are not the source of wisdom. That is something that is fickle to us.
Yeah.
In that sense.
So from that sense, this is picking up on this notion that we're not the source of what we have as creatures, right? And it's deepening this notion. It's not just the things of the world, but it's the structure of mind, right? We've shifted from the things of the world of Hashem natan v'Hashem lakach, God has given and taken, but that is referring simply to the things of the world, and now it's shifting it towards this issue of the source of mind itself, of being able even to think about, even to make that statement is not. You're not the. It's not just like you're not the origin of yourself. You're not just you're not even the source of your own reflection.
I think Midrash could say exactly such a thing.
That what?
That was Midrashic thinking.
Yes, of course, yeah. No, it's saying yes, exactly. Rachel, you had a.
I mean, I think you answered my question, but I was originally going to ask what you're saying that. But where can wisdom be found? Where's the source of understanding? Not only not only makes the notion of like man as master technique creator absurd, but also the rhetorical cast in which he's.
That's what I'm raising. I'm suggesting that it's Janus face. It's going in two directions, right? If it's going to go in the in other words, you have to say, what is the power of this? He's trying to create an unanswerable question. As we'll see, the unanswerable question will be ratcheted up beginning in chapter 38, right? It's not yet presented as an aporia. It's asked as a question that brings you to the wall. But if it's going towards that issue of techne, we have to then assume there is an interesting implication of the nature of human reasoning, right? I'm not just saying reasoning itself is a techne.
Sure.
That's what he's saying. At least that's the way I understand it. And he doesn't say it directly, but he makes you, through the question, you now have to reflect more deeply. That reasoning too is a techne. And it's dependent on any number of things, but it begins in the sublunar realm. It begins with the structure of mind. But what's the source of the structure of mind? Right? I mean, we would gladly say that a spider can't think about this, right? Or Heidegger's famous question, right? Man is the being for whom being a person is a problem to himself. That very notion, a spider can't say that, but are we, obviously we're on a scale, but we haven't broken through. That question is asked within the structure of mind. Or at least you can see that there is, what we see here is a structure of mind that's trapped in what we now know as a kind of a Kantian problem. The medievals might say you could break through, you could get to the source of wisdom by identifying with the active intellect, right? So that philosophical arrogance that moves from Aristotle to Maimonides and others, that you can actually break through and your mind can in fact get to the source of wisdom, right? And you can be, that mind is from this point of view an absolute arrogance. Philosophy is an arrogance from this point of view. Yeah.
I was wondering if we got to verse 12. Seems like there are two ways to read it. Either kind of implicitly accusing men of similarly sin of the Hebrews in the sense that,
right.
And then the relation between the talk about mind and the eye and the place will actually be kind of a distinction between the two. There's a limit between which there's a line that splits between which divides your own knowledge of what your own attempt to kind of claim knowledge of the real stuff and between the real knowledge, or that's on one hand. Second hand, that's great in the sense that an attempt to ground wisdom in a much deeper kind of dimension. These kind of two different aspects.
But it's kept open as a question. The answer is it's not going to be answered in a certain sense. The question now has opened for the sake of a new wisdom. It's the beginning of the transformation of mind.
So the question itself entails both aspects of.
Mm-hmm. He's asking this so that you enter into a new project of thought. Right?
I'm not sure if it's so much a project of thought as some sort of epistemic humility.
It's not okay. Oh yeah. At this point. But let's see whether it gets to in this other. Right. I agree. So look, and now notice he says, so a human being doesn't know. So we have Chokhmah, we have wisdom as Bina, we have Lo Yada, Enosh, any kind of human being. The creature doesn't know its worth or its value, however, or how to evaluate it. In other words, as if to say you can't, wisdom is the measure, so you can't use your wisdom to measure the measure. Right? That's what the erech is. You can't estimate it. If wisdom is the measure of mind, then you can't use your finite mind to measure the measure. Right? So that would be, you can't do that. Velo timatzei be'eretz hachayim. So now we're already shifting a totally different thing. It's not just like it's not mine, but it is something ontologically other in the radical sense.
I think this also brings us back to the very notion of discourse, which is the question. And that's the mind as it is trying to expand out of itself, trying to ask something that it doesn't know in a concrete way, something that it doesn't see, something that it doesn't have a grasp of,
Right.
and it's trying to grasp. And I think maybe that's kind of the closest thing to our approach to this type of wisdom, to Binah as opposed to the Techne. And in the act of questioning, we are at least striving toward, or that's the brain reaching toward wisdom. If it can't be broken into, at least it's expanding toward.
I agree, but that's our sense of that virtue. Because you've redefined this because in your reframing, you've given ultimate dignity to the open question. That's a very modern statement, right? In other words, Socrates would say wisdom could be found, right? Right? And it's not an ultimate open question. You have given, this is a kind of a Blanchot question, right? It's the infinite conversation, the question that keeps asking another question. And that the dignity of the self is the questioner. I think I share that virtue of what the text is dealing with, but I'm not sure that in this instance the rhetoric wants to turn this into an ultimate dignity, but to make it recursive or reflexive. In other words, to take that question and bend it back on yourself so that you deconstruct your pretension. Right? There's a way that and now this actually raises a different, since you're doing literature and other people do it, it raises an interesting literary question. Right? The literary question is that the text now is addressed to every reader. Right? It's a universal question addressed to us. It's not addressed to Job. And somehow we share in Job's structure. If you read this, it's addressed to you. And that also becomes part of this power of it, to have you bend the question. The question is forcing you to bend it back into you. And you can't read the text without appropriating the question. That's what becomes so interesting. There's no evasion, because if you were to avoid the question of this text, you avoid reading altogether. To move to the next line, you have to think about this particular question. That's not speaking to you, but it's to you in an unavoidable way. Right? That's the paradox. It doesn't say you, but it makes you complicit with any sense. It makes it kind of the rhetorical strategy is quite remarkable. So then, so now, not only can a person, an enosh, have no clue, right? Here, our text has no man can set a value. That's probably what it means in the biblical sense, right? If you look in places like in the end of Leviticus in chapter 27, where you evaluate the value of an animal, the use of erech. Okay? So that's an evaluative thing, right? Already by the early Byzantine period, the rabbis understood it in more calibrated terms. So I'm just thinking of there's a famous piyut, the liturgical poem by Eliezer Kalir, which is for Parshat Shkalim, where he talks about the Torah has ein erka. So there, in other words, it's infinite in expanse. It's infinite in expanse. So for us as later day readers, we don't have to read this only in biblical terms. It becomes a much more layered thing. But in biblical terms, the issue of estimating its worth is something that comes. And so now notice all the primordial dimensions. These are things that are going to emerge later on in the chapter. All the primordial dimensions are now personified, right? The Tehom, the primordial abyss says, Lo vihi. I don't have it, right? And the Yam, the sea. This is the mythic sea, right? That rises up from Ugaritic and other kinds of mythology. It's not just any sea. These are the primordial entities of chaos, right? And then there's no way it can't be measured, it can't be established, and he goes on all the way through till he picks up on the sense of using arach again in 17, and notice. In 17 as well, that the parallel of Yarchena, to evaluate it, is utemurata. There's no comparative substitute. There's no substitute. The rabbis use temura as a ritual substitute, zot temurati, right? But temura in this case, there's no equivalent to it. If we wanted to say, you can't put any kind of comparative way to it. And then he goes on, lo yarchena pitadat kush. Even there's no way that you can even put any kind of price to it. And 20 hechachma me'ayin tavo ve'ezem makom bina. He asked the question again with slightly different verbs. Yeah.
If I may ask now, how do you read from Ecclesiastes v'gam ad ha'olam natan b'libam?
Okay, so
in the same way.
Oh yeah. Maxim is asking where it says the phrase Elohim natanat olam belibo. So I mean that's the most ironic question in the Bible in a sense. God put enough wisdom in a person's mind to drive you nuts. You know enough to ask the question that'll drive you crazy, and you can't figure it out. In other words, that's the tragic, that from Kohelet's point of view, that's the ultimate tragedy of wisdom. You know enough to problematize the world and not enough to blast out of its orbit.
The part of the question is that there you technically read Olam in a positive way as knowledge and not in a negative way.
I think I would read Natanata Olam Belibo. He put enough knowledge of the world that you can frame questions that'll drive you up the kazoo.
Okay, it's a tangent question. So
okay.
Why is it that specifically in this part, it's a general question about the Book of Job, you have so many mentions of mythical animals specifically here? What's the rhetorical? What is the serving?
Well, we'll see when we get to the issue of Leviathan and Behemoth. But I think that part of that the issue is even the chaotic, even the unassimilable. In the case of Leviathan and Behemoth, even these creatures that are mammoth, right? That don't even look like normal features of wisdom. They're just these, they're dinosaurs up to the nth degree. Even these are things that are part of the divine wisdom. In other words, it takes you back beyond that. In other words, it pushes the question back to primordial realities. And the mind can't get around the Tehom of origins. Right? God has even created that. And your mind can't even assimilate these kind of primordial things. I think that's part of the issue. I think it's more than just a rhetoric of astonishing creatures. It means that the mind is involved in a kind of theomaky. It's a divine struggle, right, against chaos, or against forms of order that are unassimilable to the human mind. I think that's part of what the text is saying. Let's just get to the end of this, because I want to go on to the end of the part of Job. So he says, it's hidden, ne'elma, from the human eye. And here he means, of course, the natural eye and the inner eye, right? It's hidden from the inner eye and the outer eye, and from the birds. Even death says have no clue where wisdom is. But 23, Elohim hevin darka, right? It doesn't say here in this sense he created, but he knows it, the way of wisdom. And he knows its place. Right?
It's as if it didn't create it.
Right.
It's really weird.
Yeah, isn't it reflective knowledge?
Here I don't know what he's trying to... I think you can't separate this from a place like Proverbs 8, where God, Kanani Reshit Darko. But he's raising in the sense that God knows the mystery of wisdom. God alone knows the mystery of wisdom. It's interesting he doesn't say he created it, but God alone knows the mystery of wisdom and its place. Because, why? Because God is omniscient. Or at least God is all-seeing. Now, it's obviously this is a paradoxical question, because we're not dealing simply with spatial sight, right? Or if you would say, or within the vocabulary of the biblical writer, we might say that human vision, outer vision, which is reflective of the inner visionary capacity, has to always be localized. Right? But God can see the extent of things. Right? As he's using a spatial image of Earth. But I think if I was interpreting this, we had to try to interpret it in our own terms, but I'm curious what your response is. He's saying our mental structure, of which vision is a feature, is always cognitively localized. That means we spotlight, which means that we don't necessarily see the integrality of things in another place. When we're looking at this place, we don't necessarily see another place. So from the point of view of biblical writing, by saying God sees to kutsot haaretz, he's saying that God's vision is infinite. In other words, it's finitude in the maximal sense, because how could he even talk about infinitude? He's talking about maximal finitude, which means that you can see the entire spatial possibilities. Let me just finish the thing like that. And tachat kol hashamayim yireh. So it's using. This itself is a very interesting thing, given later modern philosophy and well, we don't look at in Greek and medieval philosophy, even modern, using visuality as a higher form of comprehension. There's something here that visuality does something. It becomes a very intriguing metaphor for understanding. I don't want to get into that too much, but it's a very no, I don't want to say not right now, no, because maybe at the end. But visuality has the quality of light. It has the quality it's able to talk about comprehension independent of language. Okay? But what language does is it's discursive. Vision is not discursive. In other words, I see globally. But even if I see globally in non-discursive ways, I see, or the perfect vision, insight, divine vision, mystical vision, insight, means I have a sense of the spread of things, and my first point is not to say, I don't put it into the syntax of language. So it's very interesting that many philosophies or religions which get you beyond the point of speech will often use the visuality of light as illumination, outer illumination, inner illumination. But the point is that it's not focal, it's not discursive, but it has the capacity to go beyond speech. You can't take in. If I see a phenomenological thing, I've seen much more. I would have to put it in language. I break it up into an infinite series of things. Now, as I immediately have sense of something more total, and as soon as it becomes language, it becomes my human finitude in a sense. So the closest that I begin to get as a divine being is through the mystery of light and sight, right? And that's a much larger thematic, but it's a very profound one, and he's intuited that. He's intuited the metaphor, this profound metaphor, that God is a seeing being, right? He didn't come out and first say that God said the world, and the world is, God knows this, and he spoke it. And then he says, he gives the wind its weight. So notice how he's introducing these paradoxes. How do you weigh the wind? Yeah, we're going to see when we go look at it in chapter 40 of Isaiah later. We'll take a look at it. It's parallel. And he umayim tikain b'midah. So we can't get into all of this. We'll never get through this. But I would encourage you, take a look at Yeshaya, at Isaiah 40. So he says, "Se'u marom enechem u'ra'u mi bara'el." Raise your eyes and see who created this. And then he says he has a new theology of creation, that God can weigh the wind. God can measure these things. In other words, we're dealing, in this particular case, it's not a theology of creation, but it's a sense that God is the source of this incomprehensible, right? The incomprehensible is that God can weigh wind. Not like wind exists, but he can weigh the wind. Tikain means, in biblical Hebrew, at least in Isaiah, means to measure. It's another form of measure. That's at least the way Lutzato understood that in Isaiah. Yeah.
I think maybe since we commented this initially on verse 23, it says God understands the way to it, wisdom, and he knows its source. And then he goes to say, for he sees to the ends of the earth, observes all beneath the heavens. When he fixed the weight of the winds, set the measure of the waters, when he made a rule for the rain, so he is in some...
That's part of the wisdom. That's Chokhmah.
So wisdom is the totality of all of these things. That's why he understands it, and the thing is not that he simply understands it because he said, oh, that's weird that he doesn't create it. Well, he does create it. The creation
He's
is
the Asoto.
in the water.
Nice. Thank you. That's La'asot ruach, umayim tikain, ba'asoto matar, b'derech l'chazi is called. So he knows even the reverberating vibration of thunder. Yeah. It's the nature of the imagination here is astonishing, right? to put these as a sequence that God knows the derech. He knows, we might say, the air vibration of the vibration of thunder. I mean, can you imagine an imagination at this time talking like that? That's the mystery of God. He can measure, he can calibrate the vibration of sound. It's an astonishing thing here. And he sees it, and he is able to fix it and investigate it. And he, God, Elohim, has said to the person, behold, Yirat Adonai hi Chochmah. The fear of the Lord is Chochmah. V'sur meira bina, and turning aside from evil is bina. In other words, he's not saying that you can have any state. So we now have a third definition of Chochmah. Right? The third aspect is that it's not techne, it's not the divine wisdom, it is the disposition of, there's a disposition of wisdom which understands this. And that what it does is the human wisdom is most nearly characterized as yira, as reverence. It's not the characteristic of the mind is not knowing, but wisdom is not a characteristic of mind. It's a disposition of ultimate transcendence and reverence. And understanding is knowing, is turning aside from evil. So now notice exactly. So let me just raise this. I see your response. So Job was, remember, he was Tam V'Yashar, Yirei Elohim, V'Sur Meira. Okay, so he was upright and pure. He was God-fearing, had reverence, and he departed. So now and the question there was, can a person serve God for naught? This disposition of wisdom is what needs to be interiorized to serve God for naught. Right? In other words, he had that, but this is where he's going to have to get to at the end of the book. Right? The end of the book, he has to get to a space of radical reverence where the service of God has no expectations, but simply serves the creation by not doing harm. Right? In other words, the only task a person has is to be disposed to the world with the right orientation, which is yira, that's towards God, the attitude of transcendence, and the implication for immanence is that you do no harm. That's all. Those are the two commandments, or the two postures. And I don't think he would say that one is philosophical and the other is ethical. The one disposition formulates the second. As you try to sustain the mystery of creation by an orientation of radical reverence.
Well,
Yeah.
in a certain sense, my first thought reading this is Job actually revoking his Vesal Nerahi?
He hasn't said a word. We don't know even.
No, right.
It's addressed to us, right?
Exactly.
But we're being trained to think. He's getting our heads together to get ready for the last chapters.
No. So while Job just empties himself out of any common understanding that practically knows nothing, he wishes for his own self-annihilation, which is...
But that's an annihilation of self because of the pain of expectations.
Right, and so he's getting...
In other words, to serve God, Job himself has to go through 3 stages.
Right.
The first stage is he serves God so that he has benefits. The second stage is he wants explanations. That's not serving God purely.
No, sure,
that's serving for human explanations.
But he understands that with Shit Chokhmah, he'll have to deny it, which is not...
The narrator knows this. Job doesn't know anything yet.
Not yet.
We have to see whether I think this is the mirror to understand the last part.
And the third one is fear.
I think that the third level is absolute reverence for God, and to serve God with reverence is not to do harm.
Right.
And that's not to expect. That's the task, without any expectation. In other words, there could be plenty of crap in the world, and you simply don't do evil, and that would be serving God chinam.
No, but these are... Oh, sorry.
Okay, yeah, let's just get a couple more.
In a sense, it's like an evolution. I mean, that's basically he starts out serving God with his
Expectations.
Yeah, I mean, he's doing the same thing. It's really the transformation is going on is completely an inner.
Yes, absolutely. I think the book is trying to map something of that, and if this is anticipating the end, it's anticipating the notion that to serve God for nothing would simply be when you come to a true notion of reverence. The service that you do to God is no harm in the world. There's nothing you do for God, but you serve the world by not creating harm, and that's serving God with no expectation.
The thing we never understood is that at this point, it's as if Job has completed his philosophical or anti-philosophical understanding, and then everything that goes from here until chapter 38 is a little bit in terms of, it might be seen as redundant because he is reached.
That's what many commentators say. That's why I don't want to get into the problematic of the editing. I think you can make a case that there are changes in Elihu, but I don't want to go into that in this context. Because I think it's sufficient to see the pivotal role, or you could say that it takes a while to assimilate this, and you keep going back over the old arguments a little bit till you can get ready then for the real moment. In other words, it's as if the text brought you through argumentation, brought you to this revelation of wisdom, in a sense. In some form, there's a disclosure of wisdom. There's an intuition about wisdom. It's not even a revelation. There's some kind of a fundamental intuition that's referring back to some other wisdom statement that God has given. And then we, the reader, or Job, you have to spin your wheels a little bit to go over those arguments. You have to use your fourth stomach. Chew it a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And then the ultimate moment comes, which we're going to turn to. Right? Anybody want to pick up anything more about issues of question or what's going on in this particular text? Huh?
Really short.
Yeah.
This really reminds me of Strauss's Persecution of the Art of Writing in the beginning. He tries to talk about the differences between Jewish and, say, Christian views of theology and philosophy. And he claims very pretty bluntly that Judaism is very anti-philosophical in a sense. Not in the sense that Jews don't deal with interesting questions, but in the sense that...
They don't do Greek philosophy. No, that's what philosophy...
No, in the sense that these questions are not supposed to give you any understanding of about God. beyond the pure ethical precepts.
You mean the Greek philosophy?
Philosophy is not supposed to give you any further understanding of, positive understanding of God. And this is very nicely seen here, I think, because the chapter deals mostly with the power of man and the technical and the philosophical powers, and it goes from ontological claims to epistemological claims, and then it ends with something completely different, which is just an ethical demand that has no...
But there is a theological demand.
No. Theological, yes, but it has no... The only epistemological...
Theology doesn't have content, it's a disposition, which is very... Right? Theology is a disposition of being. So this is not a theology of will. It's not a theology of speech, where God has communicated a divine truth in human terms. It's an inculcation of a disposition, right? And it's a universal. This is the beginning point. You might say, well, and you say, I'm sure that for the biblical editors, they would say, well, without this, you can't observe the law either. In other words, this is the core. This is the axial point, or else they couldn't have included these things. This is the core. It doesn't mean that one might not necessarily be a person who obeyed the commandments, but here they're trying to get, there is a core point that some people will understand and not everybody. It's not exactly the two levels of Maimonidean notion, but the Bible, by having all of this in the anthology, is telling us that there are different levels of consciousness. Okay?
I was just wondering whether we can distinguish within 23 to 28 between two levels. I mean, the corresponds to two levels of human knowledge. 23 to 27 corresponding to definite.
Right.
Whereas 28 is kind of, so definite itself,
well, a human being can't do these things, but God does that. Divine techne is a divine wisdom. It's not a techne.
No, I'm saying 23.
It's chakira in the sense, in the deepest sense. It's a fundamental discrimination.
No, I'm trying to say that 23 to 27 reflects the dimension which enables human death in the first place. So God's knowledge of nature is God
has given the created aspects. God knows of the things that the human being will fiddle and diddle with.
Which enables the death in the first place, whereas 28 is kind of God.
Right.
Reveals himself, so to speak, on a much kind of deeper level, which is the fear of God, and that's at a much deeper level.
I think it also bears reflection, at least from a literary point of view, or at least this is the way I would construe it. So, what is the tense is vayomer. There is a durative, perpetual speech, right? Now, this is not a speech that comes from heaven to earth. It's a speech that speaks through all of that if you can come to that consciousness. In other words, he doesn't say God has spoken or God taught that. Or you could say, and he has said to the person through all of this reality. It's a perpetual teaching.
Which stands vis-a-vis Blanchot.
Right.
So
it's revelation that's within the wisdom of the created order.
It's an act of,
if you can come to this level to reflect on this, you will come to the realization of wisdom and to the realization that you can't do harm to the world. But it's presented as a wisdom, not as an obedience. That's a different thing. It's a wisdom, not an obedience.
I just find it striking that it's like a different perspective of language, divine language, which, how does it send vis-a-vis God's divine activity of Blanchot?
Right.
Which is kind of, language itself, divine language in itself could be actually approached or understood as activity. God creates the world,
Right.
but then he deliberately decides, uses the word language between distinction of 28 and 25 and 26, which is
Because it's an ethical precept in my opinion.
what is ethical precept? I mean, the 20,
Yeah, it's like,
why has it ethical?
forget about everything else that's stuff, forget about all the philosophy, the technology,
But no, I can see how the right could be, a command to do something to it, and that's indeed ethical. But what?
It's an interaction.
Yeah, but it could be either ethical, but it could also be a command not in the sense of being ethical, but rather kind of a revelation of God, and introducing to man a much deeper experience of himself and the world of God as well, and not necessarily ethical.
God speaks. God says, live there.
Yeah, but why is that?
God is giving an instruction, but he's not giving a command. He's giving an eitzah. He's giving a counsel of what the wisdom of a human being should be. And the wisdom of a human being is radical reverence. And towards God, which means the entire created order of God's manifestation, right? Because God knows all these things, but it doesn't say that God is the creator, but God knows this. So God is understanding that God knows the wisdom of all things, produces a reverence of ultimate humility. And
how do you make that connection? That's what.
well, you tell me. You tell me how you understand that. I don't want to. I'm not claiming any superior understanding. I think the text opens itself up in lots of possibilities in its ambiguity. It's clear, but it's not clear.
It's kind of text.
Huh?
It's kind of part of the text, the younger tells the other to not. My reading of it, who's the younger?
God is the subject at this point, right? There's no question.
That's why it's saying this kind of shifting of the manifestation of God, manifesting himself as a creator to manifesting himself as from a much kind of deeper kind of dimension, a different dimension, which is not God as a creator, but God as someone who reveals himself, so to speak. In that sense, there's a shifting from
Right.
I'm experiencing myself in the world to the God who is in the world. That's what I want to lead to about the
Yeah. I think if you, this is not the occasion to do this, but if you read the opening chapters of Mishle, you can see a different dimension of these kinds of aspects. I don't want to compare it, but you can take a look at some of those opening chapters on your own. But we want to just read this on its own terms. But I think the important thing to realize is that this is not presented as a covenant. It's not presented as a law. It's not commented as a commandment. It's wise counsel. What's interesting here, as opposed to Mishle, the book of Proverbs, is that it's not just presented as human wisdom, right? Because God has told the human being that wisdom is, so wherever this was said or however this is said, it's not just a natural wisdom. There is something beyond the natural for comprehension here. Right? But let's leave that as it is. Anybody want to add anything more before we take a look at the ultimate section of the book? Ultimate in all senses.
I just kind of a general question.
Yeah, please.
So we're getting closer to the revelation of God and God, back in space, revealing stuff to man as well. And obviously, this is kind of a large question, but where does the relation between theology and religion come? picture.
Here?
Yes, I mean, ultimately.
Look, I think. Theology is the mind that's at the core of religious action, right? So if we see what Job did in the first chapter, he had these things, but he has certain reasons for doing them, right? The religion, from that point of view, becomes the performative, the things that are done, let us say, to obey God if it's the law, or to do the norm if the norm has to be done. And from this point of view, the wisdom or the theology is what is your mindset when you do what needs to be done. Right? There may be lots. You can do norms, you can do commandments, you can do the rituals, and then the issue is that what is the inner mind that does that? I want to keep my family together. You know, I want to have my bank account stay solid, right? I want my kids to have a good upbringing, and every Sunday they don't play baseball, but they bring sacrifices. They don't play television, but they, worship God with a good mind, right? You're putting, these all of these. That's where religion is like these epistemological blocks on the mental computer, right? So God has given all these things, so you block the kid from thinking all kinds of thoughts. it's the ultimate blockage, right? But here he's saying, so like, what should be the mind, right? It's not like that the religion should simply be that the human mind is like this computer, an iPad that goes berserk, and you can go to any website you want in the world. God has sort of allowed you only to go to certain channels, so everything works well. But lots of people say, I don't like those channels, or I want to unblock them. I'll figure a way to hack my way into another part of experience. That's what everybody does, right? They hack their way into another form of experience because they don't like being channeled, or they want the big father to control their blockage system. But here, the theology is simply saying, I don't even know what I'm talking about. My kids didn't grow up. I just know that my son monitors my granddaughter's iPad. My other son doesn't let his kids watch TV at all, so it's a different story. Not for any pious reason. It's just there are other better things to do with your time. But
so the game there is kind of like a religious conception of God, which...
Did I carry it off okay, though? Did it sound like I knew what I was talking about? Okay.
A religious conception of God, which Job is forced to reflect upon and to overcome.
Right.
And then this entire notion of experiencing or asking questions, trying to kind of unstable, shaken, kind of fixed kind of religious kind of structure of my own experience of God and so forth. The question is whether now, at this point, there is, in 28, and your relation with God entails a returning back to religion, or
I don't think so. No, okay. No. I think it's not a question on the table right now.
Okay.
And we'll see at the end it'll be a turn towards ritual and ethics, but with a totally different mentality. So this issue is to change. How do you? The text is involved with it in a conversion of mentality. Right? There's a conversion. How do you change one's total mind towards reality? That's what this text is doing, and it's not just doing it towards Job. It's doing it to the reader who is staying with that. You can't escape it. The text is that's what makes it such a text that just doesn't allow you to go. You can run and hide, but then you're not reading the text anymore. So you have to. So let's just take a look at a couple of things. Let me just raise a couple of issues, and then maybe you can come in. We have an hour, and I want to make sure we get to a couple of this things so we finish this section. But so at some point, God answers Job. Notice the preceding lines in 37. Transition is very. A human being can't see the sun unless there's some kind of a cloud cover. The splendor of God is awesome.
Where are we?
The end of 37. The north wind, the golden rays emerge. In other words, we see things by contrast. We see things by shade. We see things through kind of natural concealments, not directly. In other words, there's no immediacy of perception. Shaddai cannot be attained. You can't get your head around Shaddai. There's no dive of Shaddai. There's just power. He is great in power and justice, abundant in righteousness. He doesn't torment. At least is what Elihu says. Therefore, people are in awe of him, whom none of the wise can perceive. And now, God answers Job from the whirlwind. Okay. Now notice, it is an endless series of aporias, unanswerable questions. Now we have a new turn in question. And the unanswerable question in endless series. Because part of the issue is to break down the presumption of any level of knowledge. Right? So he begins, Mi ze machshich etza b'milim b'lidat. So who darkens counsel, speaking words without, or things, depending on how you understand milim, things without knowledge, whether it's Aramaic or it's Hebrew, it's hard to know. Anyway, but you don't know this. And so he tells God, Job, so now put on your wrestling belt and we're going to go at it, and I will ask you and you answer me. Right? So there is an inversion of the questioner and the question. Right? So now God is going to ask questions. So that's the fundamental new change that's picking up in chapter 28. But the human being now is being addressed by unanswerable questions. And has to deal. So the question is, how do questions serve to break down the mind? At what point does the mind stop trying to answer? Does God give Job any space to answer? Or is the whole function of these questions to ask these unanswerable queries so that nothing can be answered, and silence is the only answer, or submission? So look how there are innumerable ways. It begins, Mi ze machshich, who is this? And I will ask you the questions. Now, there is an endless series of questions. Where were you? Right? Eifo, where were you? Tell me, and so I can know. Mi sam, who established this so that you would know these things? Alma, so who put the foundations of the earth? And he goes on every single one, Hamiyamecha, were you ever there at a certain time? Verse 19, what is the path of light? The genius of the phrases are, have you ever come to the storehouses of snow? Storehouses of snow, right? As if there is some realm where snow has a reality. You come to the Otzrot Shelik, unbelievable. Or the storehouses of hail, right? And who has split these waters and caused things? And thus every one of these questions, or these mythic questions. Does rain have a father? In verse 28, Hayesh lamatar av, Umi holid egleital. Who has given birth to dewdrops? Right? So he is, from this point of view, in terms of the question we had seen before, it is turning the mythic pretension inside out, right? Right. The question of who gives birth. I mean, if you look at various places in the prophets or the Psalms, this playing of that there is a father to these kinds of elements, and that these were kind of mythic notions in the ancient Near East. There is this undermining of generativity, undermining of source, undermining of the capacity to conceive. I mean, can you tie the tail of Orion, the planets? I mean, it's like the question is an impossible question, and the mythic image, when it's taken concretely, becomes an even more absurd kind of a notion. And it's not simply saying God can do all of that. It's like, have you ever thought to consider the mystery of things in the most ultimate and radical sense?
So I don't know if my question confuses the literature of the feast versus the philosophical elements that you're discussing, but I think I don't understand this section in the sense that these are not the questions that Job has been asking. And it started off with God saying, okay, test him. It wasn't that Job came and said, oh, I know everything, and God said, okay, show him that he doesn't know everything. By means of plot, Job was very pious and he had everything he needed, and then God the question was raised to God that said, well, maybe if he didn't have everything, he wouldn't be so pious. And God was like, oh, we'll test him then. And then he puts him through a series of tests, and then comes with the answer, which is, well, do you know how this happened and how this... And
but what has taken place from 4 on? What's taken place from 4 on is the pretension of knowing. The pretension of knowing is the pretension of understanding the inexplicable. The very fact that this is an event that takes place in heaven means that Job has no knowledge of what's going on. Even the wise friends who say we have tradition, they don't know what's going on. Right? They're all in a bag. They have no clue. And part of the movement, you're absolutely right, the movement of the text is to shift levels of understanding. And that's why I was saying that from 28, because there is an assumption that our evaluation of things, now I would really, I think that the issue from a literary point of view, turns on the very notion of comparison. In other words, the human being's pretension to knowledge is that there is some kind of correlation between experience and justice, between what you do and how you live. That there's some kind, that you can figure out, that there's a purpose and a ratio, and that the human mind could know that. And so he knows he didn't sin, and he knows he has pain, and he knows that he's not God, so he wants to know, explain to me the proportion. I know that you're God, but at least just dope it out. Tell me what or why is the proportion, am I yam that you do this? Tell me, at least explain to me. So in other words, you have the problematic of equivalence. You have the problematic of comparison. In the deepest sense, you have, in the language of Benjamin, his thing of that essay on the mimesis, you have the pretension to make correlations and relationships, as if that's the ultimate thing that a human being can do. They can make correlations. That's part of the technique of wisdom. You bring things together for thinking. You see it during a simile, but you see it in all kinds of wisdom. Things, in Benjamin's famous essay, so he begins by talking about the ancients would make a correlation between heaven and earth, and that there's some kind of a relationship. The things go on here, have a relationship there. And every form of knowledge is, can I figure out from what I see some other thing that I can correlate it with, so I'm not thinking in a vacuum. And then part of now what we begin to see through the unanswerable question is that this whole issue of creating a logic is deconstructed.
Just one last thing.
No. Does that make sense to you?
It does. And I think that from Job's perspective, if we put ourselves in the position of Job, we say, okay, lesson learned. But in the position of a reader, essentially, we're placed maybe not on a divine level, but we have the scope that says we know the moment. We don't know how God created earth, but we know the moment that God decided to put Job through these tests, and which are ultimately punishments because he suffered.
So you want us to take us to the position of the omniscient reader. So the omniscient reader knows all of this, but wouldn't the omniscient reader then say, but he doesn't know that he doesn't know?
Yeah.
And now he's beginning to learn that the whole process is a folly. Not that there isn't a God, but the folly of getting your mind around process and evaluating it in human ethical terms is a folly. And so there are two aspects. There's an unanswerable aspect. Let me just point to one more thing and then I have some questions. Take a look at 39, 13 and following, for example. Let me, there are a couple of things that are beyond, so he says, let's go to 39. I want to just get this translation. So, look, take a look at this. Is among these astonishing questions. We talk about the ostrich, right? Right? The knaf rananim. Okay. So, the wing of the ostrich beats joyously. Okay. So this is what he's talking about. and her pinions, her wings and plumage are like the stork's. She leaves her eggs in the ground, letting them warm in the dirt, forgetting that they may be crushed underfoot or trampled by a wild beast. Her young are cruelly abandoned as if they were not hers. For God deprived her of wisdom and gave her no share of understanding. So here, the very notion that mothers protect their eggs. God created a creature that has plumage and beauty, lays eggs, and has no mind for it, and steps on the eggs or others come and eat it, and is totally oblivious. That's a divine creation. I just want to make a point. God deprived her of wisdom, but God created the ostrich. Do you give do you give the horse its strength? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him quiver like locusts, the snorting of the horse? His majestic snorting, spreading terror. He paws with force, he runs with vigor. In other words, you look at a racehorse, you see raw power. Right? Do you have any, we're not talking about just the creation. Now we're talking about divine creativity, which is just raw, naked force. Quivering nostrils, snorting, pawing the ground. Right? He scoffs at fear, cannot be frightened. That's a creature of God. The behemoth is a creature of God. In other words, what we're beginning to move towards is two things. It's not just that you can't get your mind around it, but the creativity is beyond any comprehension. And this is God's creation. In other words, he speaks, what's important here is that he speaks about everything in the created world to a person, but not about a person. Right? The human being is not the pinnacle of creation here, but he's speaking to the human being, because only the human being could actually even think about this. But he doesn't say that everything is in order and God created this and it's told and this is good and this is good and this is good and the human being is created b'tselem. Nothing like that. The human is not created in the image of God here. The human being is addressed, but only because the human being, what distinguishes if a horse snorts and an ostrich lays eggs and just goes its own way, and vultures fly the sky to pick off dead meat. God did that. He says that in the next line. That's what God did. So what distinguishes a human being? That you can actually think that. Right? What makes us different from the ostrich does the ostrich thing. And the horse does the horse thing. Right? And the vulture does the vulture thing. And all of that, in other words, God speaks about the creation, but doesn't say he created this and it's good. There's no order here, the way Genesis 1. It's a different created world. It's just the worlding of the world that's coming out of God's mouth. It's just coming out of God's mouth about the worlding of the world. So, and if we have any human merit, and we have to obviously draw a conclusion, but that's what makes us different from an ostrich and a vulture. In other words, we have a mind that can actually take all of that into account. Right? And when Job finally takes that into account, he says, Emas ve'inachem alafar ve'efer. I curse myself for the stupidity of what I was trying to say, and I regret who I am because I'm just dust and ashes, or I wallow in dust and ashes. Let me just finish. So notice what's happened here. It's not just the unanswerableness of the question. Obviously, a person doesn't know how to tie the tail onto Orion. Even just to think that is an incredible imagination, right? To comb the sea, like to part the hair of the sea, to do these kinds of things, to split the light. This is a guy or a woman is talking with. I mean, this is an unrivaled achievement of the human imagination, ever. I mean, can you imagine this? Even when it was done, and then so it's thinking in images. It's all coming out of God's mouth as a literary fiction. No, this is presented as it's not the whole book of Job doesn't present it as a revelation. It's a narrative about revelation, right? About this comprehension of this utter diversity. The taxonomy of the world in Genesis 1 is not the taxonomy here. The taxonomy of the world is each creature is its own good in its own mysterious way. It's not like all of this is good and all this is good and then you can eat this but you can't eat that, right? Each creature has its distinctiveness, and that's what a human being has to get their head around. It's a totally different kind of understanding of God as God is creator and he's not a moralist. Right? He's not moralizing the human being into a position. He's simply re-saying the creation in a fuller way than could ever have been said in Genesis 1, with a totally different. The human being is not has dominion over anything. All the human being has is an awareness of diversity that these other creatures don't have. Right? So the human being is not raised up here, but the human being is addressed as if to say, that is what distinguishes the human species, not moral grandeur and not superior. Well, it's only that the human being could hear this and even understand it. Whether you can act on it is a different story, right? So then he now falls to the ground again like he did at the end of chapter 2, but now in a very different comprehension. And then questions really end. Because he says that he spoke without any understanding. That is to say, this whole notion of trying to make correlations is an absurdity. Because he was so speaking from within his own box, as if he could establish the measure of evaluation of things and turn the measure of evaluation into a moral equivalent. There's no moral equivalency in what these animals are doing. He's not condemning the ostrich, right? So the divine creation may take on moral dimensions, but the human being can't evaluate it in moral evaluative terms. In other words, look, and then I just want to do one final thing, and then you can come back and see how. So I think that's part of the force of this question, is the absurdity of trying to formulate correlations. And then the realization that things are as the things are. Everything is its own thing. And so when Job says, I heard of you, b'shimach, I heard of you with the hearing of the ear, and now my eye, ra'atcha, I've seen you. We have again the vision. Right? In other words, it's a hearing about this, but it's a hearing that is presented as a seeing, as an insight. I have seen you. He hasn't seen God, right? But he has seen a shift in the notion of providence. God's providence is not a moral equation of benefit. God's providence is to fill the world with astonishing diversity. Right? That's the new understanding of divine providence, is that God provides for everything. As insane as it may be from a human point of view, or incomprehensible from a human point of view. So all Job can do is to say, I despise myself for the pretension of knowledge, emas, and then he says, v'nichamti. So there, nichamti, at one level means, I regret what I have done for speaking this way. That would explain nichamti in relationship to emas, right? But I think that in the light of what takes place in the next chapter, I think Job comes to another understanding of nichamti in relationship to what we've already seen anticipated in 28. It's not just that I regret that I am a human, I relent of that, or I have regret, but I have compassion. It's a more intensified form of nechama. I have compassion for the totality of existence and for myself, for all that, because I am just dust and ashes. In other words, from a radical thought of knowing, Job gets into a place of the sense of compassion with all being. For just it is as it is, as part of God's created order. And it's precisely for that reason that then God will say, you haven't spoken to me rightly like my servant Job, because he now just said that he gave up the pretension of all knowledge. It's not like the things that he said before that God is praising him. But you didn't speak of me right, that now you got to a new place. And then he says to Job, can you bring a sacrifice for Eliphaz? Right? So in other words, so he's saying, so what is the implication of sympathy at the level of ethics? Can you provide for someone who has just been maligning you without knowledge? Right? Has your level of sympathy got to such a deep level that you understand that he also spoke without knowledge? And so you also have sympathy for him, and you bring a sacrifice. And as you do, the first neighborly act is to care for the enemy or the person who criticized him. Out of the new comprehension, right? So in other words, the sor meirah is not to have resentment. right? And so now we have a totally different universe. So we have this sense, since we have a person here who studies Buddhism in the Far East, well, we have really this notion of the transformation of mind into absolute sympathy. Total sympathy with the creative order, because he now understands what it means to be a person of dust and ashes. And that all things have their... In other words, what is the wisdom that he comes to? Nothing about God, but that the diversity is so astonishing that to make judgments about how everything works and then to put oneself in the center. In other words, what finally changes is that Job is no longer the center of the moral and theological equation. Only God is the center. And it means that if Nichamti has this quality, it's not just utter humility, it means a sympathy so for everything and everybody, including the person of his neighbor. He doesn't have resentment. Lo tikom v'lo titor. There's no resentment for the person who had been maligning him. He now goes and he gives an offering. And with that changed consciousness, his life is rebuilt. His life now becomes a life of very small things, of care for his children, right? And he just lived, it's not the judgment of the universe. He again takes care of his children, but it's a different form of care. So now as we see Job going through a transformation of mind, and the book is moving in this astonishing way. It's not like God is right and now I understand, right? Or now I understand the correlations. The question was absolutely stupid, because the human being is not the center of creation. It's just one element in creation, distinguished by a mind. And if that mind does techne, is one thing. If that mind makes certain evaluations, it's led to suffering, right? I don't mean to overly stress a kind of an Eastern reading, but suffering of the mind is the suffering of the lack of understanding. And he comes out of suffering to sympathy because he has a new comprehension, which is the wisdom of the writer of the book. Right? We are given a new wisdom to go forward. So who wants to come in on it? Yeah.
This brings me back to what I said before. I'm really having trouble inferring from this Copernican ineffability and man not being the center of anything and the power of God to ethical action. It seems to me like a non sequitur.
How he gets to ethical action?
Sorry?
How he gets to ethical action here?
Yeah, it's something that I never quite understood from the book, and I still, I see you believed in it firmly, but it's still something that...
Well, you have to, look, I'm making, it's an interpretive assessment. I'm making an interpretive assessment. It's clear that the sense of divine reverence, of yirah in chapter 28 is directly linked to ethical action, but it's not ethics, but it's a consequence of a certain disposition, right? So I ask myself, the narrator, leaving aside the whole complicated editing of the book, okay, after Job's new statement of being dust and ashes, which is parallel to chapter 2, right? But at a totally different cognitive level. what does he do? God confirms him in a different way, and then he tells him to do something for his neighbor. And he does. Now, it may be that that's a non sequitur for you. Non sequitur, doesn't follow. And then one would only be left with this new change of consciousness. Either a radical humility or a radical sense of sympathy and a sense of the mysterious bounty of plenitude. Plenitude doesn't have to make sense in our terms, right? It's just, it's the fullness, olam umlo. That's really, this is olam umlo. The world in its full totality, and that's the new wisdom of his awareness. And it's God-given. It doesn't make the human being the order of things in ethical terms. So then the question is, does the last chapter give us a clue to what you do with this new consciousness? It's a literary question. Is it a clue to what you do with your new consciousness? Right? If you have this new awareness, what do you do with it? And the text seems to be implying that you go on with your religious life and your care and your building of things with this new consciousness. And one of the consequences is that you do something for a person that you had just been having total disagreements with. Whether that's ethics or not is a matter of definition. But it turns creature consciousness into creature care. Right? Call it ethics, don't call it ethics, call it theology. But a creature consciousness is not separate from a God consciousness in this context. Right? In other words, there's no distinction between the revelation and the sense of what the creation is. They're the same. Revelation and creation are linked to redemptive acts now, when a human being does it. Animals don't do redemptive acts, but a human being who does repair does a redemptive act. But so they're not set as categories, they're part of this new awareness. You go back to the world, but you go back to the world with a new creature awareness. And the creature awareness is the astonishment of everything and just being aware of that. And the question is, the book is challenging, can you take that in, and then what do you do with it if you take that in? Does that become a yira? Not a wisdom. Well, let's put it this way. I put it differently. How would we put it? There has to, if the Job issue is right, the new knowledge can't be like the old knowledge, which is an attempt to have control or explanation. The old knowledge, and you could talk about it in totalitizing, having a sense of the totality. The old knowledge was to know something so that it's not a problem anymore. So the way I would read the thing is, can you have a new knowledge that's not like the old knowledge? And I think what he's saying is that the new knowledge has to be a wisdom that doesn't try to explain. That is the new sense of chinam. Right? It doesn't mean you treat everything any way you want, but it's on the brink of a new awareness of how do you treat the world from this new consciousness. Right? So it brings you to that point that you have to make a decision. I think the last chapter shows how the narrator wants to take it, but it leaves you with a non-totalizing knowledge. It's a knowledge that's not like the older knowledge, which had explanations. It's a new knowledge that's chinam. It's knowing that and then going forward. Right? It's a different kind of knowledge. And that's a theological position.
I think that the ethical bridge that you pointed out made sense to me of a verse that didn't make sense to me earlier, which is chapter 28, verse 28. It says, "See, fear of the Lord is wisdom, to shun evil is understanding." So, fear of the Lord is wisdom because everything is opaque to humans in the sense of the order and knowledge. So all we're left with is fear because it's unknown to us. We're left with the unknown, that equals fear. And to shun evil, that's the ethical movement, because it's not doing wrong to somebody. So shunning evil is understanding. The farthest we can get are these ethical acts amongst creation. To me, that those two lines kind of...
Has enough to affect God's creation? That's what you mean? Or?
Well, so because understanding is a big word, especially in this section. If I read it in some way correctly, it says God understands the way to it being wisdom. The word understanding is attributed to a quality that God has, not to the overall argument that that's something that humans don't have. We don't have understanding. So that's why here in this last line it says, to shun evil is understanding for us, for humans. Because all we can do is these ethical acts or these acts of sympathy, these acts of kind of understanding in the sense that we are in the same situation as each other. But that's it. That's as far as we can go. So the farthest our understanding extends are ethical acts. Does that make sense?
Like the ineffability of the world makes you be more empathical towards your fellow creature and like that? Is that what you're doing?
But it's not an argument. It's a bold awareness. It's not just a logical argument. He's gone through these rhetorical questions so that he's been unminded. He has to come to a new kind of mindfulness, right?
I feel like there's this I mean, I'm reading the sort of trajectory of this whole text as progression from. There's a sense that at the beginning he's trying to have that Job has this pretense of having control over things, and that control comes in the form of he thinks that he knows how his piousness, his devotion, basically creates the illusion for him that he has control over his whole situation, and then by being tested, he's understanding that, or eventually he's understanding that he doesn't have control. He doesn't really have knowledge. He doesn't have understanding. And so, I guess when I'm thinking about ethics, it's almost like God is telling him, well, you don't understand what's behind this. You don't know, and he's giving all these examples, all these different kinds of creatures and all these different phenomena. He says, well, you really don't understand any of this, so how can you even pretend to understand the causality of your piousness bringing you a good life or bringing you happiness? He's saying you have no control of this whatsoever. You have no knowledge of these things whatsoever. So it almost seems like the question of ethics becomes almost a moot point, in the sense like, well, it doesn't matter whether,
just do what I say, and good things will come to you. But don't pretend to understand it. And it almost seems like it almost like undermines the.
But you don't know. You could do all kinds. That would be chinam. You do what you need to do, and it could still hit the fan, and you have a miserable life. That doesn't. So that would be serving God chinam. In other words, for no other purpose. As you do the consequences of that, but you don't pretend that you now understand that there is some kind of a superficial correlation between that and the consequences, right? That doesn't. So the action now moves so deeply into a radical new subjectivity that we began with. There's really the purity of his heart is to will one thing. Namely, the one thing is to serve the creation.
Yeah,
and then how you serve the creation depends on your tradition. But that's the one thing needful, is to serve the creation, which is to serve the Creator in a totally incomprehensible way. So there are an infinite number of commandments. And none.
I'm not sure we've understood ethics.
What?
Have we understood ethics then?
I think this puts this all in a different light. It puts it in a different light. I mean, those are categories from from a particular culture. The question is the nature of the relation between comprehension and action. Don't use the necessarily of ethics, but understanding and action and deed. Right? Those are the two poles, the two things that come together in chapter 28 and at the end. There has to be something that the person has to do after that, even if he just has breakfast. Right? And the text does something after that. Right? So these questions are, they're these kind of it's the koan gone berserk. Yeah. See?
Yeah. You mentioned, we juxtapose Job to Genesis in terms of the order of the world and so forth. And this might also, refer to your question about ethics. I was perhaps wondering that in both cases, men, the human being as the center. The only question is, the only difference is that in Genesis, creation is described as being in order, whereas in Job, creation is described as, world is described as a violent experience, a violent kind of God is, human being is experiencing the world in the sense that the world is doing violence to himself, he cannot control. And it's not like his ethical goods will actually change in terms of the actual act, the content of the action, but rather the only difference will be that whereas in Genesis, a human being is a center of the world, and in the sense that he's controlling the world, and he's kind of really subject to himself. And his ethical, I would say, actions are determined that this kind of relationship, man controlling the world, and hence he those are the one who kind of defines the manner in which he carries out his own ethical actions. And Job, these very actions are a result of him being subject to the world. And that's his own experience and his own, I would say, the manner in which he understands and carries out his own ethical actions. We understand exactly how. It's not about the content of what it makes or why, but rather what is their horizon which determines the significance of the X or Y, and how do I vis-a-vis the world controlling those. No, it's
from this you draw the need to act ethically because
it's not need, and we always we ask the question whether or not we have an answer. It's not whether.
And I think you're pointing us in a helpful direction, but the difference is the human being is not given a title or a task. In Genesis 1, he has a title and a task, right? La'avda l'shamra. He has to take care of the world, preserve it. There's a task, but he is created B'Tselem, whatever that particularly means, but he has a task. And the structure of the world is given to that person. That's the structure that has to be somehow preserved, whatever that means. In other words, there's a particular kind of world of distinctions, of havdalot, of mavdil. The distinctions are very different in the Job text, right? It's not distinctions of havdalot, but it's distinctiveness. Everything is distinctive, right? We're not put into a world of distinctions and separations so much as distinctiveness, right? And how you deal with distinctiveness on this massive scale as a task of wisdom is the task that the book of Job is opening us up to. It's distinctive. Everything is distinctive. And then it's up to us to figure out how to live with that distinctiveness. Obviously, we're going to make all kinds of things, to order out, make a world. But the primary awareness is of the infinite distinctiveness of the created world, not the primary distinctions that ritual must maintain, right? Or the order. So, like, for example, in Genesis 1 is mirrored in the food laws of, right, in Shmini, in chapter 11 of Leviticus. So there's a symmetry. There's no clearly formulated symmetry of action. But there is an absolute distinctiveness to everything. What you do with that awareness becomes the starting point of the new consciousness of the book of Job has given us. Because we're in the world of wisdom, we're not in the world of revealed law. God is not revealing his will, but he's revealing the pulse of reality, of things, or at least perceptible things. And in this form, the absolutely imperceptible things, like storehouses of snow. So that contributes to all of this. But we're not. So then the task, which we'll stop with this question. How does this knowledge relate to the knowledge of the commandment to obey the covenant? How does this creation relate to the other creation? How does this teaching relate to a person who is tasked with being obedient to the commandment, to be obedient? What is the nature? Is the difference between obligation to the covenant versus duty? Is duty to the creation? I think that I haven't thought it through, but I think there's a very great book. It's totally unknown by the student of William James called Josiah Royce. I don't know if that name is known to anybody. Josiah Royce, R-O-Y-C-E, and Y-C-E, And the book is called Loyalty. So there's a loyalty to creation, there's a loyalty to society, there's a loyalty to covenant, there's a loyalty to peoplehood, loyalty to creaturehood. I'm not fully happy how he worked out that book, but it's a very intriguing book, but it's not obedience, it's loyalty. And there can be a whole new ethics built around loyalty. Loyalty to the world that was given to me. And to creature. And it's different from obeying the commandments, but the Bible has given this as one totality. And then Judaism has tried to integrate these two at a higher level of, but that's Judaism's need to kind of coordinate these pieces of the text so that they become another level of correlation. But I think it is a thought experiment. How do you correlate Genesis 1 and Sinai with Job 28 and 38 to 42? How do you, in other words, it's a spiritual, theological exercise. I mean, and I give it to you for a sleepless night. I think it's if you can get your head around that, I think you can get your head around what the rabbis call ta'amei hamitzvot. You can understand why you do things. Yeah.
You're speaking reference. I mean, it would be interesting to see Soloveitchik's Out of the World when it's on the list.
That's for another class.
Right. You're right, it is. But nevertheless, taking Soloveitchik's Out of the World as a response to the Jewish problem of evil, and comparison.
Well, people haven't read it, so I think.
Well, actually, the whole collection of them, but specifically the essay compared to the two, and it's compared to evil and faith, which discusses exactly that.
So write a paper on it.
Yes.
All right. This is only the starting point for thinking. I mean, if there's something you want to work more about this as part of your final paper or things like that, this doesn't have to be the end of Job for you, right? The next phase for the next two classes will be the Mishnah and Talmud, so the questions that appear in Mishnah and Talmud. So on section 5 and weeks 5 and 6. Hopefully, and I'm not going to deal with this material as if it was a yeshiva setting. We want to ask how do the questions work for thought? What is the role of the question in this fundamental genre of Jewish literature, and how does it push thinking, make distinctions? In other words, how does it create purpose? It's a very different kind of purpose. We're now at the level of cultural hermeneutics rather than world hermeneutics or something of that nature. But I don't want to close the door on Job, and if you find any way that you want to come back to issues that are raised, but now in relationship to other things. I mean, I began with it not just because it's a quintessential text in the Bible. I could have chosen lots of others. But I also wanted this to open up thoughtfulness in a very different kind of a way, because it throws you back on your being a questioner, being a creature. And then now we have to move from this universal sense of Job to this, what happens in questions within a very specific culture that's trying to work out norms. Right? Job is not trying to work out norms. It's a very different kind of a problem. But cultures have to deal with the complexity of norms and normative behavior. And that's what that next level of question takes up. All right? So we will do that next week. Then the week after is, we meet because it's the intermeeting intermediate days of Passover, so I assume that some people may not be able to prepare as well, but just at least show up.
There are no classes in the Passover week, right?
Well, here we have class, because it's Chol Hamoed. Yeah, I chose Tuesday, Wednesday because it was the middle of it. I'm not as dumb as I look. All right. So see you next week. It's a challenge every year to choose what days to teach and what terms and what holidays. I usually mess it up, but I think I got it right this week.
Because we can't know everything.
Because you can't know. Because you can't know.